Hey everyone, and welcome to the 42nd episode of the Liam McCullum Show. I interviewed John Miltimore, the managing editor of the Foundation for Economic Education, about the economic devastation of Venezuela and how it is a cautionary tale for the US. I also have a few photos and graphs embedded in the video, so head over to YouTube if you want to see them. Remember to like, share, and subscribe, and give me a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts. Here's John. All right, John, welcome to the show.
Hey, Liam, thanks for having me on.
Yeah, do you want to just give a quick introduction for yourself?
Yeah, my name is John Miltimore. I'm the managing editor at the Foundation for Economic Education. We're one of those think tanks that is not in DC, but we've been around since the 1940s. And our mission is just to educate people on economics and the virtues of economic freedom.
Cool. And I want to cover two of your articles today, two of your recent articles. The first of which is regarding Venezuela turning to privatization after being bankrupted. Do you want to just cover Venezuela's collapse and any necessary history that got us up to this point?
Yeah, I mean, that article stemmed from a report recently in Reuters. And it was a pretty stunning report. Basically, the history of Venezuela, just to start there a little bit, they're a very prosperous country. And so, the most prosperous country in South America in the 1950s. Their labor productivity rate was higher than the United States. Their economic growth stalled a little bit in the 70s. After they nationalized parts of their oil industry. But things really changed when Hugo Chavez, he was elected president first in the late 90s. But Chavez, became elected on a platform of democratic socialism. Venezuela soon started to embrace, full-throated socialism, and they were nationalizing, various parts of their economy. Kind of throw a dart at an economic sector, and there's a good chance they were nationalizing it. It was everything from mining and farming to transportation, communications, and all those things. And there were, sadly, serious economic consequences to that. Venezuela's economy started to stall. Oh, about 2010, 2011, you can see it just in if you have a GDP, it does one of these. And, there's been, as a lot of people know, a lot of pain in Venezuela. People are fleeing the country, rampant inflation. And what's astonishing is, this is where, to come back to the Reuters article, in Venezuela, they're actually returning, these properties over to the hands in the private sector. What you have are, but everything from coffee plantations to farms that have been idle for years. They're turning it over to private enterprise, who are allowed to keep a profit. They come up with different arrangements for different sectors. But basically, I think we got to be careful. It's not a full-blown return to capitalism. I think some people, claim that Venezuela is still picking the winners and losers. They're still saying who gets these deals, who doesn't, what the arrangements are. You still have currency manipulation and price controls and all those things. So on an economic freedom scale, Venezuela is still ranks either last or dead last, depending on whether you include North Korea. But the fact that they're acknowledging that these policies, these central planning policies failed, is a pretty big story.
In that same article, you do talk about what this means for command economies and essentially how this negates command economies. Do you want to talk a little bit about what the problem is, maybe how price controls have something to do with that?
I mean, yeah, we've seen this before, right? Like, we have all these examples of command economies where they're trying to regulate commerce and economic activity from boardrooms and capitals. It's incredibly complex. Like we had a recent piece, Lawrence Reed, the longtime president, he just came out with, looking at in the Soviet Union in the early 1920s. They recognized that their war communism was a failure. Lenin, one of the most devout socialists in history, passed his new economic policy that said, look, like this isn't working, and it started to institute market reforms. And the truth is, you can't have individuals trying to regulate economies in this fashion and keep them, efficient or effective. And Venezuela isn't the first country that was a socialist economy that looked and said, this isn't working. Like these farms were operating fine when we weren't involved, and now that we uh, seized them and are trying to run them ourselves, they're idle. There's not the proper incentives to work, and we saw that, of course, like in the Soviet Union. You had all these when communism, in the late '80s, early '90s was collapsing, and they just started returning all these businesses into private hands. Um, the beauty of the market system is you don't have to regulate them. You don't have to have the state out there trying to decide what goes where, how many widgets get sent here, and what the price should be. It's the beauty of a free market is all those things are being resolved on their own. It was the same reason when you had members of the Politburo that used to come to the Americas, to America in the '80s, and they said, how do you have all these stores filled with food? Like who do you tell to get them there? Well, they didn't. All of this was a market economy that this happened on its own. And if the state is able to just step back and allow these things to happen, it's great prosperity for everyone.
Yeah. And then I was just curious about, you mentioned how they have minimum wage hikes. Do you know what the Venezuela minimum wage is?
I actually don't off the top of my head. It'd be kind of fun to look. It's always changing. I
Hmm.
think that they just tripled it, as I recall, here just recently. Um, and when I say recently, it might have been last year, the year before.
Hmm.
But no, I don't. And partly the problem is there's the way the economy's operating right now, with inflation. As soon as they increase the minimum wage, it's all being eaten away by inflation. Like if you look this year alone, they're at 3,000% inflation in Venezuela since January. Um, that's that's a lot, and it sounds like a lot. But if you go back, 2018, inflation was at 10 million% at one point. Um, and so you can raise minimum wage and say, like, this is the wage we think workers are entitled, but it shows that's really not solving the problem. Once you have a command economy like that in place, that's dysfunctional. There's really no method to. There's a lot more madness than method there.
Hmm. Yeah, I don't know. You didn't mention this in your article, but I'm wondering if you know about it. Do you know the effect that like sanctions on Venezuela may have had? Is it all just them being a socialist country, or is it also some foreign interference?
It's one of these things that whenever I share something on Venezuela, this comes up. And yeah, sanctions. Here's the thing: like there are currently harmful sanctions in place on Venezuela, and I personally think, considering the humanitarian crisis there, I would favor lifting those sanctions. I know why they're in place, and I know when they started. I think the first round came in late 2014 or early 2015 by the Obama administration, that imposed like the most recent round here after Chavez's death. Um, and but if you look, these sanctions were imposed. Venezuela was already in a full-blown economic collapse by then. Now, are they helping the situation? No. And I do think they should be lifted just for the humanitarian situation going on there. People are starving. Like it's not full-blown famine yet, but they're on the verge of a full-blown famine in Venezuela. And I think it would help people by lifting sanctions. Secondly, it would kind of you wouldn't have this ability to blame the evil Western imperialists, which is what Maduro is doing. He's like, this isn't us, it's them that that are imposing that. And I think it's a tragedy that we give them the ability to kind of say that, because whenever I share things, like I said on Twitter, people are like, oh, it's because of the sanctions. And I quickly point out, it's not hard to see when this started, an economic
Mhm.
collapse well before any sanctions were imposed on Venezuela.
So then you did reference your second article that I wanted to talk about. It's titled "Cash Disappearing in Venezuela Despite Hyperinflation." Uh, the first point is that like 400,000 bolivars can't even buy a piece of candy. Do you want to talk about what's going on over there?
Yeah, and again, it was inspired by another Reuters piece. Like Reuters is as a former newsman myself, I do hold Reuters in respect. They're one of the few places that still is doing like this shoe leather journalism. They have, their journalists in Caracas, in other parts of Venezuela that are talking to people and getting these stories.
Mhm.
Just to go back to the previous one, that was not announced by Maduro. This was, those journalists talking to individuals in Venezuela that figured out what's going on. That yes, they're returning, these businesses to people. But to go back to the other story, yeah, it's pretty crazy what you have. When you think of hyperinflation, you think of Weimar Germany, you think of Yugoslavia, and those pictures where people have currency as wallpaper, right? Because the money has become so worthless, it works better as paper than an actual currency. And so you think of these countries being drowned in all this cash. And I thought it was fascinating because in Venezuela that's really not happening. They're suffering from a cash shortage despite all the hyperinflation they have. And there's kind of two reasons for it. One is all of this money is being used at these public transit stations. Like I think there's about 3/4 of all the currency is being used in public transit because they don't have any digital system. So all of the money, people are waiting in lines to withdraw cash just so they can take the train to work because they don't have any car that would work. So all of this money is just being used for there. People aren't using cash to buy food and things like that. Like it's just I think they're using other forms of currency, and cryptos are making a big impact. Excuse me, in Venezuela right now as well. Um, and yeah, I thought like Venezuela just came out with the million bolivar. Like that was their one of their solutions where you can get $1 million note. It's worth about 50 cents. And so, it just shows trying to fight poverty with currency. You can kind of do things for a while. You can sustain things, you can mask things, but it shows the real inherent danger in trying to, solve actual, economic problems by printing paper.
Yeah, so I've tried to research this myself, but I haven't read anything about it. Do you know if like the Caracas stock market is kind of booming? It like has it gone up?
That's a wonderful question.
Mhm.
I really could not tell you that. I haven't looked into that myself. Maybe that would be a good article for me to look at. I to see if you know. I think it was Hayek or Mises that talked about for a nation, one of the real indicators of a thriving economy, of a good capitalist society, is the presence of a thriving stock market.
Mhm.
So my hunch is maybe that is not actually the case in Venezuela. My hunch is, just from a perspective of capital, um, I wouldn't want to put my capital in Venezuela right now, right? Like I think there's all kinds of reasons that you wouldn't want to do that. Like basically, private property rights are going to attract investment, and private property rights really aren't respected in Venezuela in a meaningful way. So my hunch is that their stock market is dysfunctional and doing poorly. But I haven't looked at that data at all.
Yeah, because the only data that I saw was that it appeared to have gone up at one point, and it's still like inflated. And I don't know what that would mean if it's just that it's detached, much like our stock market is in the United States right now, or what that would signal. But
Again, if it's attached to the boulevard, I'm sure it looks like it's surging, right? Because all that inflation is floating into those assets over there. But yeah, it'd be an interesting thing to look at.
okay. And then to go back to that article, I guess so. The reason that only 2% of the total money supply is in circulation is because people aren't getting the cash fast enough. Is that part of the problem?
It's funny because I said there was two points to that, and I only mentioned one, like the public transit and how money is just kind of being used, overwhelmingly for this one kind of strange purpose. But apparently, and this is even the weirder part, Venezuela is having a hard time getting enough paper to print money. They just filled a contract last year, I think late last year, with a company in Turkey to buy a ton of paper, tons of paper, and for whatever reason that contract fell through. So basically, what you have is Venezuela's central bank. They're suffering from so many problems that they literally can't get enough paper to print the amounts of the currency they need.
Yeah, that's terrible.
Yeah,
Um,
if you look I think Reuters or a different article I reference talked basically it went from the cash circulation as a percentage of money in the country decreased from like 8% down. I think you just mentioned maybe like 2 or 3%.
okay. Yeah, and then you also mentioned like you have a graph of Venezuela's GDP. What's the significance there?
It's just one of those sad, shocking things. If it's the graph I'm thinking of, it just shows how the total collapse of their GDP. How like it's a country that was, like I said, one of the most prosperous countries in the world for a long time, and you can see their economy stall a little bit in the '70s after the when they nationalized their oil industry, they got a ton of public spending resulting from that. And there's an economist I cite who notes there was more public spending in Venezuela from 1975 to 1979 than the entire history of Venezuela before that in public spending. But that did have a downside, like their economy, their economic growth stalled a little bit there. Um, you do see them start to go up again. Oil prices are booming, and everything is going wonderfully in Venezuela for a long time. The commodities prices are prone to fluctuation though, and when they had all that spending and they're using the oil industry to prop up all this spending, when oil prices came back down to earth, Venezuela was in a really bad spot, which would have been hard enough. But then, you add in the fact that they were nationalizing various parts of their economy. They suffered a catastrophic collapse in GDP. And they tried to address their economic problems, and with all the wrong solutions. They tried, like I said, through wage controls, currency manipulation, more seizing more businesses, and things like that. And then you factor in eventually the political suppression, and it becomes like basically a full-blown socialist dictatorship. And the results speak for themselves today.
Hmm. And you also mentioned that they're kind of like a fascist economic country rather than
Yeah.
a capitalistic country.
Yeah, like I said, there was sort of like, if you look at the articles that they're talking about, Venezuela is turning back to capitalism. Some people in Venezuela said that's not capitalism. It's not capitalism. The state gets to decide which properties are owned, what the deal is, like what your take is, what our take is. And if you look, that's much closer to economic fascism than any kind of capitalism. And like that's supported by the idea. If you look, economic freedom in Venezuela is still, like I pointed out earlier,
Mhm.
um, basically last in the world, unless you want to count North Korea. They're once Venezuela's one spot ahead of, or excuse me, one spot below Cuba. So that tells you how much, how capitalist Venezuela truly is.
Yeah, and then I believe Maduro actually says that the disappearance of the cash is an advantage to Venezuela. Do you want to explain maybe what you assume he's getting at there?
Yeah, no, I have no idea what he was talking about, and he didn't elaborate. Like basically, I think you've reached a point when you have strong men. You know, he couldn't. He had to acknowledge the reality that money is disappearing, and because people can't get it. But he was trying to make it sound like that's a good thing, and he is trying to switch public transit to a digital system. He's trying to, Venezuela's trying to create its own cryptocurrency. There's some of these things that are happening. But I think if you ask people in Venezuela about the money situation, then they're not going to tell you it's a good thing.
Yeah.
Waiting in line, a half hour to uh, get money out of the bank so you can ride your butt to take a bus or a train to work, doesn't sound like a very convenient thing to me.
Yeah, definitely not. And then you do get into how this can be a cautionary tale for the United States. Do you want to explain what you mean, and then kind of explain this theory by Stephanie Kelton and the other MMTers? I believe her tweet is I wrote it down here. It says Carpenter can't run out of inches, Stadium can't run out of points, and the USA can't run out of dollars. So do you just want to address that?
Yeah, no. Kelton was a economic advisor to Bernie Sanders, and she's a proponent of modern monetary theory. And basically, it's a theory that you don't really need to budget; you can just spend money, because all of this fiat money is backed up by the state, and we can print it at will to solve all these problems. And like I think for a long time that was people economists really laughed at that idea, like it wasn't an idea taken seriously. um, but if you look today, the United States is in some ways starting to take that approach. I think in stimulus spending we printed what, about $6 trillion in the last year. And if you look at Americans, like they like receiving checks. If you look at if you pull Americans, like they're kind of not against this stimulus spending because they're getting a little of it. And you can do that for a while, like I pointed out earlier. Like we have we're not Venezuela in many, for all these reasons. We have a much more free economy, a more robust economy, a functioning economy. And you can do things like that and distribute money, to a degree, but it's not free. It will result in inflation. And the real problem is if you can become addicted to that. And soon, like you're using it to solve all these problems, or try to solve these problems. So I think there is a great risk in like it's not just people in the Austrian school of economics talking about that. Lawrence Summers is one of the former president of Harvard, one of the most prominent economists in the world, and pretty much a Keynesian guy. And he's been banging the drum on inflation. Says we're looking at some very serious risks here. And interesting enough, I saw a poll today that just came out. And 52% of Americans say they're very concerned about inflation. So I find that encouraging that this inflation is actually on the radar of Americans, and it is something that needs to be taken very, very seriously. History shows hyperinflation happens. It happens all over, and to look at it and say, it can't happen here, is one of the sillier things I can think of.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I've seen it in my own life. The amount of people who are starting to talk about, I think it was the libertarian meme, the money printer go burr, and all of that. But then I'm also seeing the inverse of that. Someone came into my work the other day, and they said that they took out a loan to put some money into the stock market, for like the GameStop surge, and we're seeing the excess liquidity. I thought that was just like a tale, that like the random person does that, but I'm starting to see it in my own life. People are telling me that that's what they're doing. So are you pretty worried about it?
I think we're in a very serious moment right now. I think we don't know what financial markets are going to do. I think a lot of when I hear stories like the one you mentioned, that's sad and frightening. Like I get the temptation when markets are going bonkers, say, hey, I want some of that. I understand that mentality, but that kind of thinking is going to cause a lot of problems for people. Trying to use the stock market as a slot machine, very dangerous. We're seeing it with GameStop and some of these stocks. Hey, if you can pull it off and make money from it, I guess that's fine. There's serious risks in doing that. If you look we're seeing a big downturn now, and the truth is, like if you're invested in the market, you're kind of like not happy about that. The truth is we need a correction. I think if you talk to most people, the market's still overpriced, and but that's kind of tangential, I guess, to some of your larger points. If you look at the spending coming out of Washington, we just passed another $2 trillion stimulus bill that really didn't do much as far as stimulus. And it looks like, lawmakers aren't done. I think they want to keep doing this, target more infrastructure and spend money that we don't have, even though we're approaching $30 trillion in debt. Like I said, you can do these things for a while. Eventually they will catch up to you, and history shows that.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I think we covered everything. If you want to mention anything else, if you think we missed anything, please do, and then we can let you go.
No, I think we covered a lot of ground. I appreciate the invitation. It's fun to talk about ideas like this. They're very important. Any listeners, they can find me. Fee.org is where we, do most of our publishing. We publish everyday articles about what's going on in the news and in history and culture and lots of things in that vein. And I'm on Twitter at Miltimore79 if anybody's on Twitter. Sometimes I'm cranky and sassy on Twitter, but that's sort of what Twitter's about.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much.
All right. Thanks a lot, Liam. I appreciate it.
It's the weekend and we can let go.